I'd like to thank the organisers of this event for inviting me to participate. I was asked to talk about my involvement with scholarly research and public conversations on 19th century transatlantic African Americans and their British abolitionist allies in the north of England. And so to do this, I'm going to talk about research I've been undertaking for some years, as well as a new project. At the end of the presentation, I'll include brief details of further reading to give you more information of some of what I discuss and to give links of some of the research that underpins my own scholarship. My current research benefits from a major research fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust, the title of which is on the PowerPoint. In thinking about archives, my recent work has benefited from the work of figures including Anne Laura Stoler and Simon Gikandi. And reminding us of the importance of sharing and talking, I take inspiration from Jean Falzer. In thinking about libraries, I've benefited from the work of Walter Benjamin, Elizabeth McHenry, Alberto Manguel, and Sean Moore. I think of libraries as locations of peaceful and silent work, but also as critically important sites of sociability. While the physical site of the library is a place of sanctuary and quiet repose, a repository for archives and books, it also and simultaneously nurtures radical exchanges and loud dissent. The library, in other words, is fundamentally unquiet, though library users can also choose to experience it as a quiet site. While print culture made a major contribution to the abolition of slavery, it's the condition of what I call the unquiet library that made this possible. In the decades between the American Revolution and the Civil War, religious nonconformists in Yorkshire and Pennsylvania forged alliances based on progressive religious and political commitments to dissent. Now, we already know that nonconformists and dissenters played a crucial role in abolitionist and anti-slavery activism, in the provision of educational facilities and training, in scientific discovery, architectural innovation, and advances in medicine. But there's a good deal that we can still learn about both the way that engaged citizenship and habits of independent thought were fostered, and neglected figures who haven't yet had critical attention. The abolitionist histories of British cities such as Liverpool, Bristol and London have rightly had considerable attention, but Leeds is vital to understanding 19th century abolitionist activity. As a major northern city with large numbers of nonconformists, it played a significant part in the abolition of US slavery. African American lecturers who spoke in Leeds included William Wells Brown, Henry Box Brown, Ellen and William Craft, Alexander Crummell, Frederick Douglass, Sarah Remond, and Moses Roper. The Leeds Mercury played a key role in fostering abolitionist sentiment. But the single most important contribution came from a quiet Quaker merchant whose name remains unfamiliar. Wilston Armistead was born in Leeds on the 30th of August 1819. He spent his early life in Holbeck, South Leeds, where the city's first Quaker meeting house had been built in Water Lane in 1699. His family's flax and mustard business was also based there in Water Hall. By the late 1840s, he was running the business, raising his young family, and increasingly preoccupied by his extremely active involvement with abolition. This included the formation of the Leeds Anti-Slavery Association in 1853. He used Water Hall as a distribution centre for a series of anti-slavery tracts he produced in Leeds in the early 1850s. In the summer of 1850, Armistead visited the United States. There he met many abolitionists, but I want to focus on two particular meetings, which were of great consequence. The first was with Ellen and William Craft, whose story was already well known. He later wrote, "During my stay in Boston, I called several times on the notoriously interesting fugitives from slavery, William and Ellen Craft, who were then located there for safety. When he returned to England, and they came to England to lecture there, they stayed with him in his house in Leeds. Using this as a prompt, in the spring of 1851, He transformed the UK census into an abolitionist document when they were staying with him. He added the words fugitive slave to the UK census to describe their status. His words draw attention to the precariousness of their situation, while also suggesting the way his moral outrage was channeled into political protest. He used a piece of UK bureaucracy to protest against the United States law, this providing a vivid example of the transatlantic interconnectedness of abolitionist activism. The entry for the Armistead household is a striking anomaly in the UK records. Though other fugitive slaves were also recorded in the 1851 census, none of them are described using the language of fugitivity. For instance, William Wells Brown, who was lodging at a boarding house in the centre of Leeds, is simply described as a lodger. Meanwhile, Henry Box Brown was staying on the other side of the Pennines in Burnley, Lancashire, along with James C. A. Smith, the free black man who had helped him escape. By the time of the census, Brown and Smith had successfully exhibited the panorama show Henry Box Brown's Mirror of Slavery on both sides of the Atlantic, in Boston and in Manchester. Brown, like Smith, is listed in the census as a lodger, but each is also described as an anti-slavery advocate by occupation. The second encounter I want to talk about took place quite by chance on a train in New England. On the morning of Monday, 15th of July 1850, two strangers briefly entered each other's orbit. They were both travelling in a train going the short distance from Lynn to Boston. One of them was Wilson Armistead. The other, Thomas H. Jones, was a self-emancipated fugitive from Wilmington, North Carolina, who had escaped to New York the previous September and had subsequently relocated to New England. Their unlikely meeting would later be described by Armistead in an unsigned series, Reminiscences of a Visit to the United States in the summer of 1850, which appeared sporadically in a Quaker journal, The British Friend, from November 1850 to December 1852. Details of their brief encounter are sparse. Armistead affords it just 10 lines, writing, "In the carriage in which I was seated were 3 coloured people, one of whom I found to be a fugitive from the horrors of slavery, which he had endured in North Carolina for 43 years. He furnished me with a few particulars of his history, as also of the providential escape of his family, a wife and 3 children, whom he succeeded in aiding away previously. Having preserved this account, I purpose transcribing it briefly, in time for your next number." Embedded deep within Armistead's text are the few particulars Jones furnished him with. They comprise the first and only UK publication of the experience of Thomas H. Jones, who was a slave for 43 years. Its existence has been completely unsuspected until now. I came across this new edition quite by chance while undertaking research on abolitionist activism in 19th century Leeds. I was neither looking for or expecting to find a previously unknown edition of a slave narrative. Indeed, the inclusion of this narrative in Armistead's Reminiscences is a really striking moment in what is otherwise a relatively conventional travelogue. Though I came across the Armistead edition by chance, it was certainly a serendipitous archival encounter. The edition gives researchers, teachers, students and general readers unique new material to work with, because the larger reminiscences, which themselves have never been republished, contain both Jones's narrative and a first-person account of the moment the men met. The way Armistead describes the process of the preservation and subsequent transcription of Jones's text is revealing about his practice as an editor-activist, developed over several years of experience and subsequently further revised in consequence of reading Jones's work. He shaped Jones's narrative to fit both publication and audience, and in addition he crafted it in ways that are revealed only when it's compared with the original pamphlet. He had to contend with the implications of serial publication, including how to make transitions between journal issues, limitations of space and length, and critically, how to incorporate a slave narrative into his own autobiographically driven piece. These elements all contributed to shaping the form of Jones's narrative when it appeared serially within Armistead's reminiscences. And Armistead's writing was itself closely associated with his other activism. Since the publishing history of Jones's work hasn't yet been securely established, this new edition extends our knowledge in important ways. I situate my reading with reference to new ways of interpreting African American testimony and the circulation of transatlantic print culture. Uncovering this story involves exciting discoveries, including the new edition, but also frustrating dead ends due to silences and inaccuracies in the historical record. The meeting is a vivid example of the role chance can play in building allegiances and networks that cross boundaries, such as the nation-state. It calls for interpretive strategies to help develop models for understanding the events leading up to the physical and textual encounter and its aftermath. The first extant edition of Jones's narrative was published in Boston by the African-American printer Daniel J. Lang. Its appearance was announced in the Liberator on 1st of March, 4 months before the two men met. The texts of the Lang and Armistead editions bear a close relation, suggesting that the Lang edition was most probably the basis for Armistead's edition. But it's still worth speculating about the disputed existence of an even earlier edition, of which no trace has yet been found, believed to have been published in Worcester in 1849. Its possible existence speaks to the way Black experience both is and is not archived in the 19th century, and it reminds us how much work remains to be done in order to have the fullest picture. I've also located another previously unknown edition published in St. John, Canada in 1853, so I think that continuing to look for the missing Worcester edition is worthwhile labour. The identity of Jones's companions on the train when he met Armistead may never be known. We do now, thankfully, know quite a lot about Jones himself due to recent archivally-led recovery work. What we certainly know is that through his writing and enormous resilience, he showed the ways in which he continued to shape himself as a citizen. When Armistead wrote the Reminiscences, he was conscious of the precarity of Jones's situation. The Fugitive Slave Law was passed on the 18th of September 1850. Armistead ends his edition by the erroneous speculation that Jones is probably long ere this under the fiendish workings of the odious Fugitive Slave Law, dragged back to the endurance of chains and slavery to the end of his day. However, Jones remained free, though some details of his life remain unclear. One question I'm pursuing is whether or not he ever went to England. We know that certainly by May 1851 he was in Canada. He wrote to the abolitionist minister Daniel Foster using powerful visceral language of bodily reclamation, saying, "I know it will be a source of pleasure to you to be informed of my safe arrival here on British ground. Quite free from terror, I now feel that my bones are a property bequeathed to me for my own use, and not for the service of the white man in that gloomy and sultry region where the hue of the skin has left my race in thraldom and misery for ages." My research derives from international scholarship and uses archives from both sides of the Atlantic. But I want to suggest here that British archives are important sources for scholars of American studies, helping us to think about the United States from outside of its borders. My work aims to investigate a critically understudied transatlantic connectedness, which continued despite a dominant wider political culture, which sometimes encourages national separation and hostility. I aim to demonstrate the importance of communities that flourish outside of the formal limits of the nation-state, refusing its coercive strictures. My work gives me hope that certain kinds of connectedness can thrive even in times of extremity, and this includes our own difficult moment.